It was 1879, in that harsh, uncertain time when autumn's final gold had surrendered to the gray. Iron bite of the high plains winter. The wind that swept through Kestrel Flats, Wyoming territory, carried no memory of moisture. It was a dry, scouring wind, smelling of alkali dust and distant, frozen pine, and it moved with a lonesome, whistling sound. It whipped grit against the tall, false fronts of the mercantile and the land office, making the unpainted wood surfaces look even older than they were. The locomotive, an iron behemoth, hissed steam into the thin air, a monstrous black dragon breathing gray, its labored metallic pants dying quickly against the vast, indifferent emptiness that surrounded the town. Down the short, warped boardwalk, the sign for St. Alder's Church leaned hard to the east, its white paint flaking, as if it had long given up fighting the prevailing gales and accepted its slant. The sky itself was the color of old pewter, threatening snow but offering none, holding the midday light in a cold, brittle suspension. From the third passenger car, Nora Bellamy stepped down onto the splintered platform. She did not descend. She emerged, like a creature forced from a dark burrow. She was 18 years old, though the journey had carved fine lines of exhaustion around her mouth and eyes that belonged to a woman twice her age. Her hand, clutching the ice-cold iron rail, was raw and chapped, the knuckles white. She did not look up at the town immediately. She looked down at her feet. The shoes, which had been sturdy walking boots when she left Illinois, were destroyed. They were not merely worn, they were defeated. The leather was split wide across the toes, the soles worn so thin they were little more than flimsy suggestions of footwear. Through the gaping holes, her feet were visible, blue with cold and bruised a dark, mottled purple from walking the last 5 miles to the rail junction after the stagecoach broke an axle. The gritty planks of the platform were an immediate, sharp pain. She pulled her dress straight, a useless, automatic gesture. It was a brown calico, washed so many times the pattern was a ghost of itself. The hem, torn on sagebrush, was clumsily mended with thread of a starkly different black color. In her other hand, she held the two things that constituted her entire world. One was a small, cracked wooden valise, its corners battered, secured with a brittle leather strap. The other was a single letter, folded and refolded so many times the paper was as soft as old cloth, stained yellow and fragile at the creases. This letter was her map, her passport, and her entire store of hope. The platform was not empty. Kestrel Flats had gathered for the train's arrival, the day's main event and its only concrete link to the world beyond the horizon. Freighters in heavy canvas coats, miners with mud caked on their boots, and a few women in dark wool shawls stood watching the disembarking passengers. When Nora appeared, alone, clutching the letter, a silence fell upon them. It was not a respectful silence. It was the pause a hunter takes when spotting game. The silence was immediately followed by a ripple of sound, a collective rustle of judgment. Mail order bride. A woman's voice, sharp and low, cut through the hiss of the steam. Look at her shoes, a man muttered to his companion, not unkindly, but stating a fact that felt like a physical blow. Nora felt the eyes. They were not just looking. They were assessing, measuring, dissecting. They pierced her thin coat and weighed the poverty of her mended dress. She saw no welcome, only a hard, frontier curiosity that stripped her bare. She had spent weeks, months, dreaming of this precise moment, of stepping onto the platform and finding the start of a new life, a life built on the promises in that yellowed letter. In her dreams, there was dignity. Here, there was only the biting wind, the grit on her skin, and the open air on her bruised feet. Hope, which had survived 1,000 brutal miles, suddenly felt thin, fragile, and foolish. Shame, hot and heavy, rose in her throat, threatening to choke her. She swayed, the platform seeming to tilt under her. The line of wooden buildings blurring, she scanned the faces, her heart hammering a desperate rhythm against her ribs. She was searching for the man whose words she knew by heart, but whose face she knew only from a small, Stiff photograph sent 6 weeks prior. There, at the far end of the platform, past the baggage carts, standing separate from the others, Silas Duval. He was exactly as the photograph promised, yet entirely different. The photograph had shown confidence. The man radiated an oily, immovable assurance. His black vest was glossy wool, stretched tight over a prosperous middle, a gold watch chain looping arrogantly across it. His deerskin gloves were clean and pale yellow, immaculate. He held a small, tight bunch of white lilies, an impossible and decadent luxury in this barren land, their scent lost in the alkali wind. His eyes met hers across the distance. Nora felt a small, desperate surge of relief. He was here. He had come. But the expression on his face stopped her breath. He was smiling, but it was not the warm, eager smile from his letters. It was a smile of calculation, the quick, assessing smile of a merchant finding a flaw in a piece of goods. His gaze dropped from her face, traveled slowly down the length of her mended dress, and then lingered, with a deliberate, theatrical disgust, on her ruined shoes. He stood perfectly still for one long, agonizing second. The smile did not fade. It tightened at the corners, becoming something brittle and cruel. Then, with a casual, almost bored motion, he turned. He did not storm off. He did not yell. He simply retreated, melting back into the small cluster of townsfolk near the station master's office, becoming one of them. As he passed a stack of freight crates, he placed the white lilies on the rough, splintered wood, abandoning them as carelessly as one might discard trash. The wind plucked at the white petals, tearing one loose. A few quiet, cruel laughs erupted from the men standing near him. The sound was sharp, like rocks hitting a tin roof. The rejection was absolute. It was public. It was final. The strength that had held Nora Bellamy together from Illinois to Wyoming, the thin, stubborn wire of pride, snapped. Her knees buckled, not in a delicate faint, but in a sudden, heavy surrender to gravity. She landed hard on the wooden planks, the impact jarring up through her bones. The cracked valise slipped from her numb fingers and fell open. Its contents, meager and pathetic, spilled onto the dusty boards, exposed for all of Kestrel Flats to see. There was one other dress, gray wool, folded tight and clean, a small, precious bar of lilac-scented soap, saved for this arrival, a holy Bible, its cover loose and its pages feathered from a lifetime of use. And at the bottom, rattling in the empty space, a few copper coins. Not enough for a meal, certainly not enough for a ticket back to a life that no longer existed. This was the sum of her, the total of her worldly possessions. The crowd saw it. Silas, watching from the shade of the station house overhang, saw it. Nora stared at the spilled items. A terrible, cold emptiness filled her, colder than the wind. She felt the urge to cry, a burning, acidic pressure behind her eyes, but no tears came. The high plains wind seemed to have dried them before they could form. She only felt cold, exposed, and utterly, terrifyingly alone. She made no move to gather her things. She just knelt, broken, in the center of the platform. He had been there the whole time, unnoticed by her, by them all, leaning against the main support pillar of the post office, separate from the crowd. Calder Pike had watched the entire pathetic drama unfold. He was holding a worn saddle over one arm, the leather dark with use, waiting for a shipment of twine. His hair was the color of cured tobacco, sun-streaked from seasons spent without a hat, and it fell over his brow. His face was angular, weathered by the same wind that now tormented Nora, but his eyes were clear and steady. When Silas Duval turned away, Calder's jaw tightened. When Nora fell, and her small, desperate belongings spilled, his eyes did not hold the pity she felt from the others. Pity was soft and useless, a luxury for those who were not in pain. What was in his eyes was harder, sharper. It was recognition. He had seen this kind of breakage before. He had seen what this land, and the men in it, could do. He pushed himself off the pillar. The jingle of his spurs was quiet, measured, not a boast but a simple fact of his trade. He walked past the whispering onlookers, who parted slightly for him, their mockery hushed by his presence. He stopped in front of the kneeling girl. Nora sensed the shadow falling over her before she saw him. She flinched, bracing herself, expecting another kick, verbal or otherwise, expecting to be told to clear the platform, but he simply knelt. His movements were economical and slow, without hurry, the way a man moves around a spooked horse he does not wish to frighten further. He crouched on his heels, bringing his gaze level with hers. He placed a small, wooden canteen, dark with age and water. On the platform beside her spilled Bible. His voice was low, rough like sanded wood, and held not a trace of pity or judgment. "What's your name?" She looked up, startled, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. His eyes were a startling gray-blue, the color of the sky just before dawn. She had to swallow dust to find her voice. It came out as a bare whisper. Nora Bellamy." He nodded once, a short, sharp gesture, as if confirming something he already knew. He did not say it was a pretty name. He did not offer condolences. He simply began to gather her things. His large, calloused hands moved with surprising gentleness, picking up the soap, the Bible, the folded gray dress. He placed them gently back into the valise, even retrieving the few coins that had rolled near a crack in the boards. He did not rush. When he was done, he closed the lid and latched the single strap. He did not stand up. He remained crouched, and he offered his hand, palm up. It was a scarred, strong hand, stained with leather dye and marked by old rope burns. He did not try to grab her or pull her up. He just offered it, holding it steady in the cold air between them, waiting for her to make the choice. From the shadows of the station house, Silas Duval watched this development. His amusement had vanished, replaced by a flicker of sharp, possessive annoyance. He had intended for the girl to be an object lesson, a piece of broken luggage to be swept away by the station master. He had not accounted for Calder Pike. Calder felt the stare, a prickle on his neck. He glanced up, his eyes meeting Silas's across the 50 feet of dusty platform. There was no open challenge, no threat, but in that brief, locked gaze, a volume was spoken. Calder's expression was flat, a quiet, profound contempt that was far more insulting than any shouted word. He gave a very slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. It was not a negation. It was a dismissal. "I see you. I know exactly what you are." Silas stiffened, his immaculate deerskin gloves balling into tight fists at his sides. But he did not move. He would not confront Calder Pike. Not here, not now. Calder turned his full attention back to Nora. She was still looking at his open hand, as if it were a trap. Slowly, drawing on the last, tiny ember of courage she possessed, she placed her small, chapped hand into his. His fingers closed around hers. The warmth of his skin was a shock, solid and real against her frozen fingers. He rose in one smooth motion, lifting her to her feet as he stood. She was unsteady, the world still spinning, the shame thick as mud on her. She instinctively tried to hide her ruined shoes, pulling her skirt around her ankles. Calder saw the gesture. He did not ignore it. He looked down at her feet, then back to her face. He touched the brim of his stained hat, a gesture of respect that felt so foreign, so shocking in her profound humiliation, that it almost made her weep. "You came here with torn shoes," Calder Pike said. His voice was quiet, but it seemed to cut through the wind and silence the whispers. Nora flinched, her eyes closing, thinking it was the start of another, quieter insult. "That means you brought everything necessary." The words settled in the cold air. They were not words of comfort, which she would not have believed. They were not words of charity. They were a statement of fact, spoken by a man who understood the currency of survival. He was not looking at her as a failed bride or a charity case or a woman. He was looking at her as someone who had endured the journey and was, despite all evidence, still standing. The sentence hung between them, solid and real. It was, in its own rough way, a promise. He did not lead her through the main street of Kestrel Flats. He kept her on the platform, walking her past the station house, past the freight office, to where a single, sturdy buckskin horse was tied to a hitching rail. The horse was unremarkable, built for endurance, not for show. Its coat the color of dusty gold. The whispers of the crowd followed them, a low, buzzing sound like trapped hornets. Nora kept her eyes down, fixed on the splintered boards moving beneath her bandaged feet. Calder had retrieved her ruined boots, tying them by their broken laces to the handle of her valise. He did not seem to hear the crowd. He moved with an indifference that was its own kind of armor. He tied her valise onto the back of his saddle, next to his own saddlebags, securing it with quick, efficient movements. Then he unhitched the horse, swung himself up into the worn leather seat, and looked down at her. "Up," he said. She stared at him, confused. There was no wagon. There was only the one horse. He leaned down, extending his strong right arm. "Put your foot on my boot. Grab my arm." She did, her body moving with a numb, dreamlike obedience. Her bandaged foot rested in his stirrup, and his grip on her forearm was like a steel clamp. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, swinging her up to sit astride behind him, her skirts bunching awkwardly around her legs. It was the first time she had ever sat on a horse this way, without a side saddle. The animal's back was wide and warm, its proximity to the man in front of her alarmingly intimate. She had nowhere to put her hands. She gripped the back edge of the saddle, the cantle, her knuckles turning white. Calder did not say anything. He nudged the horse with his heels, and they moved. They walked the horse past the last building, the livery, and then Kestrel Flats was gone. It did not fade. It was simply erased. One moment they were in a town. The next they were in an ocean of gray-green sagebrush that stretched to every edge of the world. The vast pewter sky seemed to press down, and the wind, free of the buildings, hit them with a solid, physical force. The horse's gait was a steady, jarring walk. Nora felt herself slipping on the smooth leather of the saddle. She clutched the cantle tighter, her raw hands screaming in protest. "You'll ride yourself raw doing that," Calder said over his shoulder. His voice was not loud, but it carried easily back to her. "Put your hands on my waist, or hold the coat, but you have to ride with the horse, not against it." She hesitated for a long time. To touch him felt like a surrender she was not ready to make, but as the horse navigated a shallow dip, she was thrown hard against his back, her chest colliding with his shoulders. "Hold on," he said again, his voice flat, slowly, her hands frozen and stiff. She let go of the saddle. She placed her palms flat against the rough wool of his coat. The material was thick, smelling faintly of wood smoke and horse. Beneath it, she could feel the solid, steady warmth of his body, the subtle shift of his muscles as he moved with the animal. After another few minutes, as the cold seeped deeper into her fingers, she slipped her hands just inside the edges of his open coat, pressing them against the small of his back for warmth. He did not react. He just rode on. They rode for what felt like an hour, perhaps two. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of the horse's hooves on the dry, gravelly soil and the high, lonesome whistle of the wind through the sage. There were no birds. There were no other travelers. There was only the endless, rolling land. The fear that had been frozen inside her at the station began to thaw, replaced by a new, sharper anxiety. This man, this stranger, she was miles from anywhere, completely at his mercy. Silas Duval had humiliated her, but this man, what did he want? The silence gave her panic room to grow. She had to break it. Her voice, when it came, was a dry, cracked whisper, almost stolen by the wind. "Why are you helping me?" Calder Pike did not turn. He kept his eyes on the barely visible game trail they were following. He let the question hang in the air for a long moment, letting the wind carry it away. Nora thought he had not heard her, or had chosen to ignore her. She was about to ask again, but then he spoke. "Because I've seen people wait," he said. His words were simple, stark. She waited for more, but none came. The horse took another 10 steps, and I've seen what happens when nobody comes. That was all. It was not an explanation. Not really. It was not about her. It was not charity. It was a statement from his own unread history. A fact as solid and unforgiving as the landscape around them. And because it was not about her, she believed it. The sharp spike of her fear receded. She did not relax, but she stopped bracing for a new kind of betrayal. She settled into the rhythm of the ride, let her head drop, and watched the gray-green scrub pass by in a hypnotic, endless blur. The sun was past its weak zenith when Calder reined the horse to a halt. They were in a shallow basin, protected from the wind, where a narrow creek, no wider than a man's stride, ran clear and bright over a bed of polished silver stones. A few naked cottonwoods stood guard beside it, their white branches skeletal against the sky. He dismounted in one fluid motion. "We'll rest the horse, and see to your feet." He reached up for her. This time, she put her hands on his shoulders and let him lift her down. When her bandaged feet touched the ground, her knees gave way immediately. The muscles cramped and useless. He caught her, his hands steady on her waist, holding her upright until the life flowed back into her legs. He released her as soon as she was stable. She stood, swaying, while he took a clean canvas cloth from his saddlebag. He led her to a flat-topped boulder near the water's edge, warmed by the thin sunlight. "Sit," he said. She sat. He knelt before her, as he had on the platform. The gesture was so at odds with the harshness of the land, it seemed to belong to another world. He lifted her right foot, his movements slow, deliberate, and entirely impersonal. He began to unwrap the bandage, which was now stiff with drying blood. Nora watched his hands. They were scarred, the knuckles broad. The skin cracked from lye soap and cold, but his touch was methodical. He unwrapped the last layer of cloth, and she looked away, ashamed of the wound beneath. The open blisters were raw. The skin of her heel cracked deep into the flesh. Grit and dirt were embedded in the wound. Calder did not flinch. He showed no pity, no disgust. "This'll bite," he said. He dipped the clean cloth into the icy, clear water of the creek. Nora bit her lip, bracing herself. When the cold, wet cloth touched the raw wound, she gasped, a sharp, ragged intake of breath. The pain was clean, a bright, shocking sting that seemed to wake her from her numbness. "Hold steady," he said. His touch was firm. He did not dab at the wounds. He cleaned them, meticulously, his rough fingers working the grit from the broken skin, his eyes focused on the task. He was not tending a woman. He was dressing a wound. The very impersonality of it was its own form of respect. He re-dipped the cloth, rinsing it, and cleaned it again. He did the same for the left foot, which was just as bad. Nora kept her lip clamped between her teeth, her fists clenched in the fabric of her skirt, but her eyes, which had been dry and burning, slowly softened. The stinging pain was, at least, an honest sensation. When he was satisfied, he took 2 more squares of clean, dry cloth from his pack and carefully rebandaged her feet. She stared at the raw, clean wounds. They looked pathetic, a map of her failure. "Pain is the mark of a long road," Calder said quietly, as if speaking to himself. He stood, tossing the soiled cloth into the moving water and watching it drift away. "It's not the mark of the end of it." He went back to the horse, retrieving a small parcel wrapped in oilcloth. He sat on the rock beside her, not too close, but sharing the same small space of sunlight. He unwrapped the parcel, revealing dried beef and 2 dense, hardtack biscuits. He handed her a strip of jerky and one of the biscuits. Her stomach recoiled, but her body cried out for sustenance. She took it. The jerky was smoky and saltier than anything she had ever tasted. So tough she had to tear at it with her teeth. It was real. It was solid. She ate, and the gnawing hunger that had been her companion for days finally subsided. They ate in silence, sharing sips of cold, clean water from his metal canteen. The quiet between them was no longer empty. It was a shared space, filled with the sound of the creek and the small, necessary act of survival. They rode on. The sun, A pale coin began its long slide toward the jagged western horizon. The land changed, the gray sage giving way to rolling hills of pale, honey-colored grass. The sky itself seemed to shift, the pewter clouds breaking apart, allowing shafts of thick golden light to pour through, illuminating the vast emptiness. As the light thickened, Calder guided the horse to the crest of a high, flat-topped ridge. The wind, which had been their constant tormentor, suddenly died, as if it had struck an invisible wall. The silence was profound. The land fell away before them into a wide, protected valley. A shallow basin shielded on all sides by high, red rock mesas. The low-angle sun set the cliffs ablaze, painting them in shades of deep ochre, fiery orange, and dark, blood red. And there, nestled in the curve of the northernmost cliff, safe from the wind, was a ranch. It was not a grand operation. It was a single log house, built solid and low to the ground. A long, sturdy barn stood beside it, connected to a web of empty corrals. From the stone chimney of the house, a thin, perfectly straight plume of white smoke rose into the still, darkening air. It was the only movement in the entire valley. Nora stared. She had not realized, until that moment, that her shoulders had been hunched up to her ears for days, braced against the cold, against the stairs, against the future. She felt them drop. A knot of ice, lodged deep in her chest since Silas Duval had turned his back, began to dissolve. A slow, painful, and wondrous thaw. Calvater stopped the horse, letting it breathe. He pointed with a gloved hand, his voice quiet in the immense stillness. Home, Painted Mesa Ranch. Nora let out a breath she felt she had been holding since she left Illinois. It came out of her ragged and uneven, a small, painful sound. It was the first breath she had taken in 1,000 miles that did not taste of fear. They rode down the gentle slope into the valley. The air was warmer here, protected, smelling of cured grass and the sharp, clean scent of juniper. A single rocking chair sat on the wide, covered porch of the house, beside the door. A weathered wooden sign hung from 2 leather straps. The carving was deep, the letters clear, Painted Mesa, and beneath it, in smaller script, Where the Wind Stops. Calder dismounted. He untied her valise, his saddlebags, and his saddle. Lifting the heavy gear off the horse with an easy, practiced movement, he slapped the buckskin on the rump, and it trotted gratefully toward the barn and a waiting water trough. He did not carry her. He took her valise and his own gear, placing them on the porch. Then he turned to her. She was standing on the packed, dry earth, her bandaged feet a stark white against the dark ground. She looked at the house, at the smoking chimney, at the rocking chair, and then at him, her eyes wide with a question she did not know how to ask. He did not answer it. He just walked to the door, pushed the heavy plank open, and stood back, holding it, waiting. The light from inside spilled out, golden and warm, smelling of coffee and cedar smoke. It was one large room, spare but meticulously clean. A fireplace on the far wall, a table, 2 chairs. It was a shelter. Nora looked at the dark, cold land behind her, then at the square of warm light before her. She took a step. She crossed the threshold, moving from the vast, indifferent twilight into the small, defined warmth of the room. At the train station, she had been an outcast, pushed to the margins, left to freeze. As she stepped over the raised plank of the doorway, she felt a profound, physical shift. She was no longer outside. She had been counted in. The first morning at Painted Mesa was a lesson in cold. The Wyoming dawn did not arrive softly. It snapped the horizon, flooding the valley with a light so clear and thin it seemed to possess a sound, like the ringing of distant crystal. The air inside the small log house was still and frigid. Nora had slept on a narrow cot near the hearth, buried under 2 heavy wool blankets and her own coat. The fire had died to pale gray ashes, and she could see her breath, a small, fleeting cloud in the dim light. She woke with a profound sense of dislocation, the events of the previous day rushing back the station, the lilies, the long ride. A sound from the adjoining room, a boot scuffing the floor, told her Calder was awake. Duty overcame shame. If she was to stay, she could not be ballast. She threw off the blankets, the cold hitting her instantly, a slap that stole her breath. She dressed in the gray wool dress, her fingers stiff and clumsy on the buttons, and hurried to the main stove. It was a black iron beast, squat and formidable. She had built fires her whole life, but this was different. The kindling she found in the wood box felt damp. The wood was iron-hard juniper. Her first attempts produced only sluggish, acrid smoke that stung her eyes and filled the room. But no flame. She heard Calder move behind her, but he did not speak. She struck another match, her hands trembling with cold and frustration. Finally, a small, stubborn flame caught the edge of a wood shaving. She fed it obsessively, chip by chip, until the larger logs finally took hold. Only then did Calder move past her, his presence large and silent in the small room. He took a battered tin pot and a scoop of dark, crushed beans to the stove. He did not speak to her, but moved to the water barrel, breaking a thin skim of ice on its surface with a dipper. He filled the pot and set it directly on the stovetop, adding the grounds straight into the water. Nora watched, feeling useless. Coffee's particular, he said. It was not a rebuke, just a fact. When it boiled, he took it off the heat, tossed in a splash of cold water from the dipper to settle the grounds, and poured 2 cups into tin mugs. He handed one to her. The coffee was black, scalding, and impossibly bitter, thick with grounds at the bottom. It tasted of smoke and earth, but it was hot. It was the hottest thing she had felt in weeks. She drank it, the liquid courage spreading through her limbs. After the coffee, the work began. He did not ask her if she was ready or if her feet hurt. He simply put on his coat, picked up a heavy water yoke, and walked to the door, assuming she would follow. She pulled on the heavy, oversized wool socks he had left for her by the cot, and then the makeshift shoes she had made the night before. They were crude, just scraps of oiled canvas and leather from a broken harness. Tied on with twine, they were hideous, but they covered her healing feet. The barn was colder than the house, smelling sharply of hay, cold leather, and the warm, animal musk of the horses. The buckskin, whose name she learned was Barley, nickered at them. Calder did not lecture. He taught by doing. "This is a pulley rig," he said, pointing to the rope and wheel that lifted hay into the loft. He showed her the lock knot. "Once. Your turn." Her fingers, numb with cold, fumbled the thick, stiff rope. The knot slipped. He did not sigh. He did not grab it from her. He just waited, his gray eyes watching, patient as stone, until she untangled it and tied it correctly. He handed her a pitchfork. "Muck the stalls. Barley's in the 2 mares. Pile it there." He pointed to a spot outside the barn door. The work was heavy, humbling, and honest. Her back screamed, and her hands, soft from weeks on the train, felt the splintered wood of the fork handle. She was slow. He worked beside her, his movements economical and powerful, cleaning the stalls of 3 other horses in the time it took her to do Barley's. But he never once made her feel slow. He simply let her do the work. He let her measure herself against the task, not against him. By mid-morning, a wagon pulled by a single mule appeared, rolling down the track that led to the valley. Nora tensed, her hand tightening on the pitchfork, her immediate instinct to hide in the barn's shadow. Calder saw the wagon and nodded. "That's Maeve." A woman, broad-shouldered and wrapped in a man's heavy sheepskin coat, reined in the mule. She was perhaps 40, her face weathered by the same elements as Calder's, her brown hair pulled back in a severe, practical bun. She climbed down from the wagon seat with a groan of stiff joints, holding something wrapped in cloth. She nodded to Calder. "Pike." "Maeve." Her eyes found Nora, who had half emerged from the barn, dust in her hair, manure on her canvas shoes. Maeve Kestrel's gaze was sharp, and it missed nothing. It saw the mended dress, the youth, the exhaustion, and the fear. But unlike the eyes at the station, There was no judgment in it. There was only a profound, weary recognition. It was the look of a woman who knew exactly what the world did to other women. "Heard the train brought cargo," Maeve said, her voice dry as the wind. She looked back at Calder, raising an eyebrow. "She's staying," Calder said. "Working." Maeve looked at Nora again. A long, assessing look. Then a small, wry smile touched her chapped lips. She held out the cloth-wrapped bundle. "Brought sourdough. Figured the air up here was too clean. Needed something to smell like a home." Nora stepped forward and took the bundle. It was a loaf of bread, heavy, dense, and still wonderfully warm from the oven. "Thank you, ma'am," Nora whispered. "Maeve," the woman corrected. "Ma'am is for women who don't muck stalls." She gave Nora one last, appraising look. "You'll do," she said, more to herself than to either of them. She climbed back onto her wagon, clucked to the mule, and was gone. That evening, they sat on the porch. The cold was a living thing, biting deep, but they were wrapped in blankets. Calder was mending a bridle, his hands moving with practiced, efficient strokes, stitching new leather into the old. The silence, which had been awkward in the morning, now felt shared. The warm bread sat in Nora's stomach, a solid anchor against the fear. "My father," Nora said, her voice small, seeming to come from nowhere. "He gambled." Calder did not stop his stitching. He just grunted, a quiet sound of acknowledgement. "He gambled away the farm after my mother passed. Then he gambled away her things. Then he just left. Walked out one morning for tobacco and never came back." She stared out at the red cliffs, now turning a deep, bruised purple in the twilight. "I had nowhere. I worked at the seamstress shop, sleeping in the back, but she was unkind. The letters from Mr. Duval, they were a lifeline, a way out." She touched the cracked valise, which sat by the door. "He wrote of a home, of needing a partner to build something." He sounded steady, honest. She laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "I thought it was a lifeline, but it was just a stone, something to tie to my ankle and pull me down." Calder finished a stitch, pulled it tight with a sharp tug. He did not look at her. He looked at the floorboards of the porch, at the space between them. "My mother," he said, his voice low. "Eveline Pike. She came west with my father, following a dream that was never hers. He died of cholera 2 weeks after they got here. Left her with me, 2 mules, and a broken wagon." He paused, testing a strap for strength. "She built this ranch. Cut the logs herself, hired a few miners down on their luck to help raise the beams. She did not know how. She just did. She wore a pair of men's boots she found by the road." He looked at Nora, his gaze direct and clear. "When she died, 20 years later, she was still wearing them. The leather was gone. The soles were tied on with rags. They were just as torn as yours." He bent his head back to his work, as if the conversation was over. But then he added one more thing, his voice so quiet Nora had to lean in to hear it. "But she walked upright until the end. She never knelt, not for anyone." Nora finally understood. That day on the platform, he had not seen a ruined girl. He had seen his mother's shoes. The next day, Calder decided she would learn to ride properly. He did not put her on barley. He let out a surly, mean-eyed gray mare with a P branded on her hip. "This is Flint," he said. "She's stubborn. She'll test you." He showed her how to saddle the horse, how to check the cinch. He cupped his hands for her foot, and she swung up. The moment she was in the saddle, Flint laid her ears back flat and took 3 quick, jarring sideways steps. Nora cried out, grabbing for the saddle horn, her balance gone. "Don't pull her head," Calder said, his voice sharp. "Hold with your legs. Show her you're not baggage." Nora tried, but she was riding her fear, not the horse. Flint felt it. The mare dropped her head, arched her back, and gave one small, efficient buck. It was not a violent move, just a dismissal. Nora flew off, landing hard in the dusty, cold-packed dirt of the corral. The fall knocked the wind from her. She lay on her back, stunned, staring at the vast, indifferent sky, every part of her body aching with the impact. Calder stood at the rail, making no move to help her. You staying down there, the old Nora, the girl at the station, would have wept. She would have stayed down, drowning in the humiliation. But this Nora, the one who had survived the first night, the one who had mucked stalls and shared coffee with a man who understood her shoes, felt something different, a bubble of absurd. Hysterical sound rose in her throat. She spat the dust from her mouth, and she laughed. It was a rusty, cracked sound, the laugh of someone who had forgotten how. It shocked her. It visibly surprised Calder. She laughed, a real sharp bark of pure, frustrated amusement. She had come 1,000 miles to be publicly humiliated, to freeze, to muck stalls, and now to be thrown in the dirt by a horse. It was too much. It was, somehow, funny. "No," she said, her voice rough. "I'm not staying down here." She grabbed the rail and pulled herself up, her body a symphony of new bruises. She walked, limping slightly, to the horse, which was now standing placidly. As if nothing had happened, she grabbed the reins. Again, she mounted. Flint tried the same sidestep. This time, Nora was ready. She gritted her teeth, drove her heels down, and stayed centered. The mare snorted, disappointed, and then, accepting the new terms, settled into a rough, jarring walk. It was not a victory, it was an agreement, but as she circled the corral, sitting upright, she felt it the first solid piece of dignity she had built for herself. That night, they took turns sitting on the porch, listening to the high, rhythmic squeak groan of the windmill. It was the ranch's pulse, the sound of water being drawn from the earth. "If it changes pitch," Calder explained, "it means ice or a broken vein. You listen for the change." So they sat, in the shared, cold dark, listening. The silence between them had changed again. It was no longer empty, no longer shared. It was warm. It had become a comfort, like the heavy wool blankets. Calder worked by the light of the fire, as he often did. He was carving a small, rectangular piece of wood, a scrap of juniper. He was not a delicate carver. His strokes were deep, sure and economical. He finished, rubbing the wood with a bit of saddle oil to bring out the grain. He set it on the mantelpiece, above the fire. Nora looked at it. He had carved 2 words into the wood. Juniper ember. She looked at the tough, stringy juniper wood in the wood box, able to survive wind and drought. She looked at the deep, glowing red embers in the heart of the fire, a heat that lasted all night, long after the bright flames were gone. He did not explain the metaphor. He did not have to, before she went to sleep. Nora sat by the fire, working on her own project. Her canvas shoes were failing. She had taken a piece of thick, discarded leather from the scrap pile in the barn, using a sharpened awl and a length of waxed sinew. She was trying to make a sole. Her hands were raw from the day's work. Pushing the awl through the thick hide was agony. Her stitches were huge, uneven, and crooked. The resulting shoes were ugly, misshapen things, barely recognizable as footwear. But they were hers, made by her own hands. She stood on the porch in her new, crooked shoes, looking out at the valley, now silver under a high, cold moon. She thought of the station. She thought of Silas Duval and his glossy vest, of his easy, cruel dismissal. She thought of the white lilies, wilting on the freight crate. The shame was still there, a cold, hard knot, but it was no longer just shame. Something new was wrapped around it, a slow, cold, patient anger. It was not the hot, quick anger that demanded a slap or a shout. It was the cold, slow, building anger that demanded a reckoning. He had built a platform of lies, using her hope as the wood. She looked down at the ugly, strong shoes she had made. She would build a truth. She would find a way to return the humiliation he had served her, not with violence, but with the one thing he could not endure. She would bring the facts of him, and of her, into the bright, unforgiving light. A week passed. Then 2. The work at Painted Mesa was a rhythm, a steady beat of hauling water, mending fences in the cold, and checking the herd. The labor was a balm. It was hard. honest, and left no room for the ghosts of the train platform. Calder was a quiet teacher. He spoke little, but his presence was a constant. Nora's hands, once raw, were hardening, the blisters turning to calluses. Her body, once weak, now ached with the satisfying soreness of muscle put to use. The quiet was broken, as it always was, by Maeve Kestrel. She arrived on a Tuesday, the air sharp with the metallic smell of imminent snow. She did not bring bread this time. She brought news, and she was not smiling. She sat at the rough-hewn table in the main room, refusing coffee, her gloved hands clasped in front of her. "The talk in Kestrel Flats has settled," Maeve said, her sharp eyes on Nora. "And it's not about you anymore. It's about him." Calder stopped oiling a harness, his attention fixed on Maeve. "Silas Duval," Maeve continued, her voice low. "He's not just a man with a sour disposition. He's an agent, a land agent for the Union Pacific Railroad." Calder's head came up. "The spur line they abandoned." "They haven't abandoned it," Maeve said. "They're just acquiring the land quiet-like before they announce the new route. And they need water rights. They need access to Nighthawk Creek." Nora looked at Calder. His ranch was the only one that bordered Nighthawk Creek for 5 miles. "He's been doing this for a year," Maeve said. "Finds a widow, a single woman with a deed. Promises marriage. He gets them to sign loan papers, promissory notes. They think it's for a wedding dress or a new roof. The ink he uses, it's pale, fades to nothing in a month. But their signature remains. And he writes new terms above it." A cold, sickening dread uncoiled in Nora's stomach. "Several widows have lost their land," Maeve said. "Martha Gable, the Henderson sisters. They're ashamed, too ashamed to fight. He calls them debtors, or jilted lovers who turned sour." "The man is a snake," Calder said, his voice flat. "He's worse. He's a patient one. Pastor Alder at St. Alder's keeps all the old town records. He's seen the deed Silas files. He says the paperwork is ironclad, but the stories, they don't match." Nora had been listening, her hands frozen in her lap. Now, a memory, sharp and specific, pierced the fog of her journey. "The envelope," she whispered. Calder and Maeve looked at her. "His last letter," Nora said, standing, her chair scraping the floor. "The one I received just before I left. The postmark." She hurried to her cot, pulling the cracked valise from underneath. Her hands trembled as she unlatched it. There, at the bottom, beneath her gray wool dress, was the small bundle of letters that had been her hope. She pulled out the last one, the one with the railroad ticket. She brought it to the light of the window. "Look," she said. The postmark from Kestrel Flats was thick, the ink blurred, as if it had been pressed onto a damp surface, and the seal on the back. She had been in such a hurry, so excited, she had not truly seen it. It was not a clean wax seal. It was gummy, puckered. "It was opened," Calder said, his voice a low growl. He touched the edge of the flap, steamed open and resealed. "But why?" Nora asked, her mind racing. "Your letters to him?" Maeve said, the realization dawning on her face. "What did you write?" "I wrote about my life," Nora said, ashamed. "About my father leaving, about being alone, that I had no family, no money. That this was my only chance. I was desperate." "You gave him the weapon," Maeve said, not unkindly. "He wasn't just reading your letters. He was collecting them, editing them." "Editing. To make you sound like you were only after money," Calder said, his logic cold and sharp. "To build a case, so when he abandoned you, he could paint you as the one who broke the contract, the gold digger." The humiliation of the train platform returned. But now it was not just shame. It was a cold, calculated plan. He had been setting the stage for her failure, for her public disgrace, long before she ever stepped on the train. That night, Painted Mesa was quiet, but it was no longer a peaceful quiet. It was the silence of a bowstring pulled taut. "Jebediah Fry," Calder said into the darkness, long after the fire had burned low. "He's the postmaster, a weak man, likes whiskey, owes money to everyone, and I'd wager Silas holds the biggest note." "What are we going to do?" Nora asked. The mail logs, Calder said. If Silas was tampering with the mail, Fry would have to have been involved. And if he was, he'd be careless. He'd leave a trail. They rode to Kestrel Flats under a sliver of moon. The landscape bathed in a ghostly, silver light. They did not take the main road. They followed the creek bed, the horses' hooves muffled by the sand. The town was a collection of dark, silent squares. A single light burned in the saloon, the sound of a tinny piano drifting faintly on the wind. They did not go to the post office. They went to a small, dilapidated shack behind the livery. Calder dismounted, tying barley and flint in a small stand of cottonwoods. "Wait here," he said. He did not knock on Jebediah Fry's door. He walked onto the porch and simply opened it. Nora waited. The silence stretched. 5 minutes. 10. She heard a single, raised voice. Fry's, high and whining. Then Calder's, a low, steady rumble. Impossible to understand, but carrying the weight of an ultimatum. The door opened again. Calder emerged, followed by a small, trembling man clutching a set of keys. Fry looked like a terrified rabbit, his eyes wide in the moonlight. "He'll open the office," Calder said. "He'll wait outside." Fry scurried ahead of them, his boots kicking up dust. He unlocked the back door of the post office, pushed it open, and then retreated to the shadows of the alley, pulling a flask from his pocket. Calder lit a small, shaded lantern, keeping the flame low. The room smelled of canvas mailbags, ink, and stale tobacco. "What are we looking for?" Nora whispered. "The dispatch log and his private ledger." It did not take long. Calder moved with a predator's efficiency. He found the dispatch log, scanning the columns of dates. Here, packages from Cheyenne to Duval, every 2 weeks, marked legal forms. "That's not a crime," Nora said. "No," Calder said. He moved to the desk. It was a mess of papers. But in the bottom drawer, under a stack of wanted posters, was a different book, a small, black ledger. He opened it. It was not a mail log. It was a record of debts. Jebediah Fry's personal accounts. "Here," Calder pointed. $200, advanced by S. Duval, marked paid in service. A floorboard creaked outside. Fry, coughing nervously in the alley. "We need to go," Nora said, her heart hammering. "Not yet." Calder's eyes were scanning the shelves behind the counter, where packages waited for pickup. He moved toward a stack of thick, manila envelopes. His hand stopped on one. It was not addressed to anyone. It was blank, but it had Silas Duval's name on it as the sender, the railroad's address in Cheyenne. It was thick. He did not hesitate. He broke the wax seal. He pulled out a sheaf of papers. He spread them on the counter in the lantern's weak glow. They were legal documents, liens, promissory notes. And at the bottom of the stack, one single document. It was a lien placed against the water rights of the Nighthawk Creek, citing a default on a loan. The land was part of the Painted Mesa Ranch. The document claimed that the owner, Calder Pike, had offered the water rights as collateral for a loan advanced to his intended bride, who had since defaulted. The signature on the bottom, in a flowery, unsteady hand, read Nora Bellamy. Nora stared at the name. It was her name. It was not her handwriting. "He forged my name," she breathed. The air left her lungs. "He was going to take your land, using me. He is going to," Calder corrected, his voice a blade. He folded the document, sliding it inside his own coat. "This is the proof." They left the office. Fry was slumped against the wall, his eyes closed. Calder did not look at him. They mounted their horses and rode back to the valley, the forged document a cold, hard weight against Calder's ribs. They sat at the table until dawn. The forgery spread between them. The full scope of the plan was now horrifyingly clear. He had lured her there to be his pawn. Her public humiliation was not just cruelty. It was a necessary part of his legal strategy. By making her a public outcast, he could file the lien, claim she was a runaway debtor, and seize the water rights before Calder even knew what was happening. "We will burn these lies," Nora said, her voice shaking, but not with fear. It was a cold, pure rage. "We will burn them all with the light of day, not just with light," Calder said. "With the law." The next day, they rode back to Kestrel Flats. This time, they went in daylight. They did not go to the sheriff. They went to a small office tucked between the assayer and the bathhouse, with a single, freshly painted shingle, Ellis Rowan, attorney at law. Ellis Rowan was young, barely 25, with thinning red hair, spectacles, and a suit that was too large for his thin frame. He looked more like a librarian than a frontier lawyer. His office was filled with books, stacked high on the floor. He listened. He listened for a full 30 minutes without interrupting, his head tilted, his pale blue eyes watching Nora as she told her story. She told him everything: the letters, the station, the forged signature. When she was done, he sat back, tapping his fingers together. "Mr. Duval is a prominent man. Miss Bellamy, he represents the railroad. The railroad is this territory. To accuse him of forgery, of fraud, that is a tall tree to climb." "We have the forgery," Calder said, placing the document on the desk. Rowan examined it. "A good forgery. But he will say you signed it. He will produce witnesses, men on his payroll, who will swear they saw you sign it. It is your word. A stranger against a town builder. "So you won't help," Calder said, his voice flat, already moving to stand. "I did not say that," Rowan said, a small, keen spark in his eyes. "I hate men who use the law to commit theft, but I cannot fight him with this alone. This forgery is one branch. We need the entire tree. We need his pattern. You say he did this to other women." "Maeve Kestrel says so," Nora replied. "Hearsay." Rowan dismissed. "We need the county land ledger, the main plat book, the old one, from before the new courthouse was built. If Duval is grabbing land, he would have had to alter the original county maps, the original surveys. Those maps are the bedrock. If we can show his filings don't match the original survey, we can prove a pattern of fraud." "Where is this ledger?" Calder asked. "In the old records room," Rowan said, "which is, unfortunately, in the courthouse basement, guarded. I cannot get it." Calder and Nora looked at each other. "Maybe you can't," Calder said, "but we know someone who might." Maeve Kestrel met them at the edge of town, near the abandoned tin mine, its entrance a dark, gaping wound in the side of the hill. "The courthouse," Maeve laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Rowan is a fool. The guards are paid by the railroad. You can't walk in the front door, but you can crawl in from underneath." She lit a lantern. "The new courthouse was built over the old mine workings. My husband was a foreman here. He told me the main ventilation shaft for the mine was repurposed. It comes up right under the floor of the old records room." She led them into the darkness. The tunnel was low, claustrophobic, and smelled of damp earth and rust. The air was cold, dead. They walked for what felt like a mile, their lanterns throwing huge, grotesque shadows. Finally, Maeve stopped. "Here." She pointed up. An old, rotten wooden ladder was bolted to the rock wall, disappearing into a perfectly black, square hole. "That's the shaft. It's a 30-foot climb. The records room is right above it, but it's locked from the outside." Calder looked at Nora. "Your hands, are they strong enough?" "They are now," she said. Calder went first. Nora followed, the lantern tied to her belt, illuminating the narrow shaft. The wood was slick with moisture. They emerged through a small grate into a room. The air was thick with dust. The floor piled high with forgotten, leather-bound books. "The county ledgers," Nora whispered. It took an hour. They searched by the dim lantern light, the dust making them cough. "Calder, here." Nora had pulled a huge, rolled map from a dusty cubby. It was the original survey plat of the Kestrel Valley. She unrolled it on a table, the parchment cracking. There, in the margins, were notes, calculations, revisions. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Silas Duval's. He had been planning this for months, redrawing the boundaries, parceling out the water rights. And tucked inside the roll, a single folded paper. It was not a forgery, it was an official filing. It was a lis pendens, a notice of pending action filed by Silas Duval against Nora Bellamy. It claimed that she, his absconded fiancée, had broken her marriage contract, and he was petitioning the court to seize her assets in damages. And what assets had he claimed? One parcel of dowry land, commonly known as the Nighthawk Creek. He had invented a dowry that never existed, and then claimed it. Her humiliation at the station was the proof he needed to file the claim. He had it all, Nora said, her voice hollow. He had it all planned, and now, Calder said, rolling up the map in the filing. So do we. They met Rowan in the alley behind his office. The moon high and cold. They gave him the documents. He unrolled the map, his eyes wide in the moonlight as he saw the notes. He read the abandonment filing. A slow, wolfish grin spread across his face. "This is it," Rowan whispered, his voice trembling with a lawyer's joy. "This is the whole tree, root and branch." "So we take this to the judge," Calder said. "No," Rowan said, rolling the documents up with reverence. "A judge can be bought. A judge can be railroaded. No, we don't take this to a judge." He looked toward the town square, dark and empty. "We take this to the town. We pull this lie out into the middle of the street, right in the sunshine, and we let the people see what kind of man they've been admiring." Sunday, the one day the High Plains paused their relentless assault on human endeavor. Kestrel Flats was alive. Its single dusty street transformed into a sprawling, noisy market. Ranchers, miners, and townsfolk mingled, the air thick with the smell of roasting corn, dust, and livestock. Cages of chickens clucked. A blacksmith hammered in a ringing rhythm, and women haggled over bolts of calico and sacks of flour. It was a picture of community, loud, vibrant, and utterly normal. The noise faltered, starting at the north end of the street, like a rock dropped into a pond. A silence spread outward, ripple by ripple. The haggling stopped. The blacksmith's hammer paused mid-swing. 3 figures were walking down the center of the street. They were not dressed for the market. They were dressed for a reckoning. Calder Pike led the way. Not by much, but his presence cleared a path. He wore his work coat, his hat pulled low, his face set in the flat, impassive mask of a man doing a job he did not enjoy but would absolutely finish. Beside him, Ellis Rowan, the young attorney, seemed even thinner and paler than usual, his spectacles polished, his ill-fitting suit brushed clean. He was clutching a thick rolled-up oilcloth parcel to his chest as if it were a shield. And beside Ellis, walking with a steady, measured pace, was Nora Bellamy. She was not the girl who had collapsed on the train platform. She wore the same mended brown calico dress, a uniform of her past, but on her feet were the crude, strong leather shoes she had stitched with her own hands. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and her eyes, which had once been wide with fear, were now narrowed, fixed on the center of the square. They were terrified, but they were also cold. The crowd parted for them, a sea of confused, curious faces. They stopped at the largest, busiest stall, a heavy plank table set up by the mercantile, piled high with sacks of beans and coffee, and, as if summoned, he appeared, Silas Duval, immaculate in his Sunday suit and glossy vest, stepped out of the hotel, a cup of coffee in his hand. He had been holding court, laughing with the bank manager. He saw the trio, and his laughter did not stop. It merely changed, becoming a performance for the crowd. He sauntered toward them, the picture of aggrieved confidence. He stopped 10 feet away, smiling, his gaze dripping with theatrical pity. "Well, well," he boomed, ensuring everyone could hear. "The ragged bride, have you come to demand your honor? Girl, I'm afraid that's a bill you'll have to pay yourself." A few of his cronies laughed. The rest of the town just watched, silent, waiting. Nora's hand tightened into a fist at her side, but she did not speak. Ellis Rowan, his voice trembling only slightly, stepped forward onto the small wooden crate behind the table, using the stall as his podium. "We are not here to demand Mr. Duval," Rowan said, his voice surprisingly clear in the sudden quiet. "We are here to present—" He untied the oilcloth parcel with deliberate, trembling fingers. He spread the first document on the table, on top of a sack of beans. It was the Nighthawk Creek lien. "This is a document filed last week by Mr. Duval, a lien against the property of Calder Pike." Duval scoffed. "That is a private business matter. Rowan, a debt owed by this runaway." He gestured to Nora. "A debt," Ellis Rowan's voice gained strength. "Or a forgery." He held up the paper. "This document claims Miss Nora Bellamy signed a loan agreement before she ever set foot in this territory. A convenient document, filed only after she was publicly abandoned and left with no means to defend herself." A low murmur started in the crowd. "He is a liar," Duval shouted, his face darkening. "A desperate, ambulance-chasing boy. Am I—" Ellis unrolled the second document, the huge, cracked survey map they had taken from the mine. He spread it wide, its edges spilling over the table. "This," he said, "is the original county plat map, and these—" he pointed to the spidery notes in the margin— "are Mr. Duval's own calculations, redrawing the boundaries of the Nighthawk watershed, written 6 months ago, long before his fiancée ever arrived." The murmur grew louder. This was no longer about a jilted bride. This was about land. This was about water. "And here," Ellis said, his voice dropping, "is the filing he made to seize the dowry of his runaway bride. A dowry that never existed. A woman he never intended to marry. A plan to use a woman's hope to steal a man's water." "This is slander," Duval roared. He took a step toward the table. "It is the truth," Nora Bellamy said. She stepped out from behind Calder's shadow. She was visibly trembling, but she stood tall on her homemade shoes. She was looking directly at Silas Duval. "You invited me here," she said, her voice clear and carrying. "You used my honesty as a weapon. You planned my shame. You thought I was nothing but the shoes I was wearing." She paused, taking a ragged breath. "I walked a long road in torn shoes, Mr. Duval, but I will not walk circles around a lie." The town was absolutely silent. Silas Duval's face was no longer amused. It was purple with rage. He saw the doubt in the eyes of the bank manager. He saw the suspicion on the faces of the ranchers. He was losing. He turned on Calder, seeing an easier target. "Pike, are you going to hide behind the skirts of this cast-off? Are you going to let this boy and this woman do your talking, or are you a man?" He bunched his fists, trying to draw Calder into a fight, into a brawl that would dissolve the evidence in a cloud of dust and blood. Calder Pike had not moved. He looked at Silas, his gray eyes flat and cold. "We are not here to brawl," Calder said, his voice a low rumble. "We are here to sign a true bill of your crimes." "You," Silas was losing control, the veins in his neck bulging. "You will pay for this." "No, Mr. Duval," a new voice called out. Maeve Kestrel stepped out of the crowd. She was holding a sheaf of letters. "You will," Maeve said. "You wrote to me, too, after my husband died. You promised marriage, in exchange for signing a deed of trust." She threw the letters onto the table. "And me," another voice. Martha Gable, a frail woman in black, stepped forward, holding her own letter. "And the Henderson sisters." One by one, 4 women, all widows, stepped up, placing their letters on the table. Ellis Rowan quickly lined them up. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ellis announced, "it seems Mr. Duval is a man of great consistency. An identical promise of marriage, an identical proposal for a loan, an identical signature, all within the same 6 months." The crowd gasped. This was a conspiracy. This was a betrayal of all of them. "This is the house of God," another voice boomed. Pastor Alder, in his black Sunday coat, pushed through the crowd, his face grim. He was holding the heavy, leather-bound church registry. "The law may be slow, Silas," the pastor said, his voice ringing with moral authority. "But the Lord's book is precise. You filed an intent to marry Miss Gable in May. You filed an intent to marry Miss Henderson in July. And you filed for Miss Bellamy in September. all while writing these letters. It was over. The trap was sprung. Silas Duval did not yell. He did not speak. He broke. He let out a low, animalistic roar and lunged. He was not lunging for the evidence. He was lunging for Calder. He swung his fist, a wild, clubbing right hook aimed at Calder's face. The crowd screamed. Calder did not flinch. He did not retreat. He moved, faster than Nora had ever seen him move. He did not block the punch. He caught it. His left hand shot up, clamping around Silas's wrist, stopping the blow dead in the air, 6 inches from his face. There was a moment of absolute, frozen silence. The town's most prominent man held fast, his arm shaking, his face a mask of primal fury, defeated by a single, economical motion. Calder just held him, his grip like a steel trap. In that frozen moment, Ellis Rowan pulled a small, metal object from his pocket. He brought it down on the forged lien document with a loud, metallic clack. This document, and this testimony, notarized in full view of the town of Kestrel Flats. Sunday, October 21st, 1879. Ellis shouted, "This will make the circuit court listen!" Calder released the wrist. He shoved Silas backward, stumbling, humiliated, his arrogance shattered. Silas looked wildly around. He saw the wall of hostile faces, the ranchers, the miners, the women. They were all staring at him, their expressions hard with contempt. He had no allies left. He turned and ran. He shoved a woman aside, making a desperate break for his horse, which was tied at the hotel rail. He would ride. He would get to Cheyenne. He would use the railroad's power to crush this. He reached the boardwalk. A small, trembling figure stepped in front of him. It was Jebediah Fry, the postmaster. He was pale, sweating, and shaking so hard he could barely stand. But he blocked the path. "No more, Mr. Duval," Fry whimpered, tears streaming down his face. I can't. I'll tell them everything. The mail, the letters you had me open, the ledger. I'll tell it all." This was the final blow. Not the lawyer, not the cowboy, but the weak, terrified man he had bullied. Silas Duval stopped. He looked at Fry, then at the crowd, which had now formed a silent, menacing semicircle around him. There was nowhere to run. Nora watched him. She watched this man, who had held her entire life in his clean, gloved hands, utterly broken. She felt the shame that had been her constant companion, the cold knot in her stomach. Finally, uncoil and dissolve. There was no joy. There was no triumph. There was no hot surge of vengeance. There was only a deep, profound, and quiet calm. It was the feeling of a woman who had just set the first, heavy, perfectly square stone of her own foundation, right in the center of the town square. The ride back from Kestrel Flats was not triumphant. It was a long, silent passage through a world that seemed to be holding its breath. The adrenaline of the confrontation had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and the cold, heavy knowledge of what they had started. The sky, which had been clear and cold that morning, was now changing, congealing in the west to a bruised, greenish purple. The air grew heavy, the usual high plains wind dying to an oppressive, electric stillness. They were halfway back, navigating a high ridge. When the stillness broke, it was not a gentle prelude. The first gust of wind hit them like a physical blow, a solid wall of air that staggered the horses and tore Nora's breath from her lungs. The temperature plummeted, the air suddenly tasting of iron and ice. "It's a norther!" Calder yelled over the sudden, rising howl. "We won't make the house, the barn!" He spurred Barley into a hard, lurching gallop, heading not for the ranch house, but straight for the large, dark shape of the barn, which stood exposed on the open mesa. Nora, on flint, clung to the saddle horn, her knuckles white, her body slammed by the gale. The first pellets of ice-laced rain began to hit them, stinging her face like needles. They reached the barn doors and tumbled off the horses, the wind tearing at their coats. Calder fought the heavy wooden door. shoving it open just enough for them to lead the frightened animals inside. He and Nora threw their combined weight against the door to close it, the wood groaning in protest, before he dropped the heavy, ironclad timber bar into place. Silence. The abrupt absence of the wind was a shock, a sudden, deafening vacuum. Outside, the storm shrieked, a high, thin sound like 1,000 keening voices. But inside, there was only the sound of their own ragged breathing and the nervous shifting of the horses in their stalls. They were soaked, chilled to the bone, and trembling, as much from the sudden cold as from the day's lingering adrenaline. The barn was a cavern of darkness, smelling of dry hay, cold leather, and the warm, animal musk of the stock. "Stay there." Calder's voice came from the blackness. Nora heard him fumbling by the workbench. A match scraped, flared, and then a steady, golden light bloomed as he lit a lantern. He did not hang it high. He set it on a low, upturned barrel near the center of the main walkway. The light did not fill the barn. It created a small, intimate room within the vast, howling dark. It cast a warm, yellow glow on the packed earth floor, on the rough-hewn wood of the stalls, and on them. Nora stood, her arms wrapped around herself, shivering, her damp hair plastered to her cheeks. Calder looked at her, his own face streaked with rain, his hair matted. The lantern light carved deep shadows under his cheekbones and in the hollows of his throat. He looked as weary as she felt. "That was," Nora said, her voice small, seeming to break the profound stillness between them. "That was just the beginning, wasn't it?" Calder stared at the lantern flame, watching it dance in an unseen draft. He unbuttoned his soaked coat, shrugging it off. "Yes, Silas," she continued, the words tumbling out. "The railroad, the men who laughed. They won't just stop. They won't let us be." She was thinking of the long, cold winter ahead, of the fight that had moved from a public square to a long, grinding war of attrition. What if tomorrow is just a longer, harder fight?" Calder lifted his gaze from the flame and met hers. His eyes, in the lantern light, were dark, but the gray in them seemed to capture the gold. "It will be," he said, his voice low and certain. "Tomorrow is a war, and the day after. But they aren't here now. The storm has shut the door on them." He took a step, moving from the darkness into the edge of the light. He was just a few feet from her. The air between them was electric, charged with the cold, the shared danger, and the unspoken things that had been growing since the day he pulled her up from the platform. "If tomorrow is a war," he said, his voice even lower, "then tonight is the breath we take. Tonight is where we stand still." He was looking at her with an intensity that made her skin flush, a warmth that had nothing to do with the cold. He was not the impassive rancher, not the quiet protector. He was just a man, standing in a circle of light. He took one more slow step, closing half the distance between them, and then he stopped. He did not reach for her. He did not touch her. He simply stood, his hands loose at his sides, and waited. The storm howled outside, a distant, feral sound, but in the golden bubble of the lantern, there was only this profound, ringing silence. His eyes, steady and clear, asked the question he would not put into words. It was a question of permission, of want, of readiness. Nora's heart, which had been hammering with cold and fear, now hammered with a different, sharper, more profound emotion. She had been given nothing, her entire life. She had been taken from, betrayed, abandoned, and claimed, but she had never, not once, been asked. She looked at this man, who had seen her at her lowest, who had shared his home, who had stood for her, who had caught a punch for her, and she gave the smallest, slightest, barely perceptible nod. He moved. He did not rush, but leaned in, his body still a respectful distance from hers. He was giving her every possible second to turn away. She did not. The first touch of his mouth on hers was not a kiss. It was a question. It was tentative, impossibly gentle, a soft, dry pressure that was little more than a breath. It was checking, asking again, Are you sure she gave her answer? She did not move forward, but she did not retreat. She softened, her lips parting slightly under his, a silent, yielding yes. The kiss deepened. It was not a kiss of fire, or of hunger, or of the brutish passion she had read about in forbidden pamphlets. It was a kiss of finding. It was a kiss of arrival. It was slow and deep and sure, and it tasted of the cold rain on his skin and an impossible, steady warmth from within. It was the warmest thing she had ever known. His left hand, the scarred, calloused hand that had cleaned her wounds, came up. It did not go to her face or her hair. It moved to the small of her back, his palm resting flat and solid against her spine, just above her waist. It was not a gesture of pulling or of possession. It was a gesture of support, a gesture that said, I am here. I am not going anywhere. Stand with me. The simple, respectful touch broke the last dam of her reserve. She felt a courage she had never known. Her own hands, which had been clenched at her sides, rose. They did not tremble. She placed them on the hard muscle of his shoulders. She could feel the tension in him, the strength he was holding in reserve. She felt the solid, steady beat of his heart through his damp shirt. Slowly, as the kiss held, one of her hands moved from his shoulder, sliding up to the back of his neck, her fingers tangling in the damp. Cool hair at his nape. He made a low sound in his throat, a sound of relief, of acceptance, and the kiss changed, becoming less a question and more a statement. They stood there for a long time, the world reduced to the circle of lantern light and the drum of the rain on the roof. When they finally broke the kiss, they did not pull apart. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. She kept her hand on his neck, her other on his chest, feeling the new, rapid rhythm of his heart. They just breathed, inhaling the same small pocket of air, smelling of hay and rain and each other. The pins that held Nora's hair, soaked from the ride, finally gave way. Her heavy, damp hair tumbled down her back and over her shoulders, one thick strand falling forward to brush against his cheek. A small sound escaped her, a sound that was half a sigh and half a choked, quiet laugh. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated release. He smiled. It was the first time she had ever seen him truly smile. It was not the wry twist of the mouth she knew. It was a full, unguarded smile that lit his eyes from within. I'm here, she whispered, the words spoken almost against his lips, as much a promise to herself as to him. So am I, he breathed, his voice rough. He kissed her again. This kiss was different. It was surer, deeper. It was the kiss of two people who had found the one other thing in the world as strong and scarred as they were. It was a promise sealed, not spoken. When they parted this time, the cold of the barn was returning, seeping into their damp clothes. Calder kept one arm around her waist, holding her close, and looked around. His eyes fell on a thick, dark wool blanket, folded neatly on a rack, kept for new calves or long nights in the barn. It was clean. He reached for it, shaking it out. He did not hand it to her. He unwrapped it and then, in one smooth, encompassing motion, wrapped it around both of them, pulling her against his side, tented together under the heavy, warm wool. He guided her to a pile of clean, dry hay in an empty stall, just at the edge of the lantern's glow. They sat down, their backs against the solid wood of the stall, their legs pressed together, the single blanket cocooning them. Outside, the storm spent its fury, the wind howling its frustration against the walls. The ice-flecked rain hammered the roof, a relentless, violent drumming. But inside the barn, inside the small, golden circle of light, inside the shared warmth of the wool blanket, there was only stillness. Calder put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned her head against his chest. She could hear the steady, slow rhythm of his heart, a counterpoint to the wild rhythm of the storm. His hand, the one that was not holding the blanket, found hers in the folds between them, his calloused fingers interlaced with hers, callous against callous. A perfect, unspoken fit. They did not speak. There was nothing left to say. The day's battle was over. Tomorrow's had not yet begun. There was only this night, this shelter, this breath. They sat for hours, listening to the storm pass. The lantern on the barrel flickered. The oil was running low. The golden circle of light shrank. The flames sputtered, danced one last time, and then vanished. The darkness that filled the barn was not the cold, empty blackness of before. It was a warm, shared, and sheltered dark, and in it, two hands held fast. No promises were made, no vows were spoken. There was only the new, unshakable certainty. They were not alone, and they were, finally, home. The dawn that followed the storm was cold, clear, and treacherous. The air was washed clean, the sky a fragile, pale blue, but the peace of the barn, the shared warmth of the blanket, shattered the moment Calder opened the heavy door. It was not the storm that woke them fully. It was the smell, smoke, but not the clean, resinous scent of their own chimney. This was the acrid, oily stench of kerosene, and under it, the high, thin, terrified screaming of the goats. "No," Nora breathed. Calder was already moving, grabbing the water buckets. "The goat pen!" They ran from the barn. The small, three-sided shed they had built for the nanny goats and their kids was a pyre. Flames, bright yellow and orange against the pale morning, licked up the dry timber, the roof already collapsing inward. "The buckets!" Calder roared, already at the main trough, smashing the thin layer of ice with his fist and plunging the buckets deep. Nora grabbed two and ran, her crude leather shoes slipping in the half-frozen mud. The heat was immense, a physical blow that drove her back. "The gate!" Calder yelled. He threw his bucket of water high, a hissing, steaming splash that seemed to do nothing. "We can't save the pen. We save the herd." He dropped his bucket, grabbed a heavy fence post, and used it as a ram, smashing the burning gate of the pen. It collapsed in a shower of sparks. "Hiya, get!" he roared, waving his arms. A wave of terrified, bleeding animals poured out of the inferno. Two were missing, but the rest, singed and screaming, scattered into the open field. Nora and Calder threw bucket after bucket of water, not at the main fire, but at the dry grass surrounding it, beating back the embers with wet canvas sacks, stopping the blaze from spreading to the barn or the house. They worked in a frantic, choking silence, their lungs burning, their eyes streaming. An hour later, it was over. The pen was a smoking, black ruin. Two goats were dead. The rest were huddled, trembling, by the far fence line. Nora leaned against the water trough, her body shaking. Soot streaked across her face. Calder stood in the mud, staring at the wreckage, his breathing harsh. "He did this?" Nora whispered, the words tasting like ash. This was his answer. "Yes," Calder said. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble. He walked not to the burned pen, but to the patch of muddy ground behind it, where the arsonist would have hidden. He knelt. The ground was soft from the storm's rain. "He was in a hurry," Calder said. He pointed. A single, clear hoof print was pressed deep into the mud. "This horse was shot in Cheyenne, a heavy shoe with a notched heel. I saw 3 of them, tied outside the Black Lark saloon. Railroad muscle. They weren't just here to drink." He stood up, wiping the mud from his hands, and looked toward Kestrel Flats, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. "He tried to burn us out. They did not wait. They did not clean themselves. They saddled Barley and Flint and rode, the smell of smoke still on their clothes. They were in Ellis Rowan's office by 9 in the morning. Maeve Kestrel was already there, as if summoned by the smoke on the wind. When they told him, the young lawyer's pale, scholarly face did not register shock. It hardened. "Good," Ellis said, tapping his fingers on his desk. "Good," Nora repeated, incredulous. "He murdered our animals. He tried to burn us down." "Yes," Ellis said, a keen, dangerous light in his eyes. "And in doing so, he has delivered himself into our hands. Fraud is a paper crime. It's hard to prove. But arson is a rope crime. He's overplayed his hand. He's desperate. Ellis stood, grabbing his coat. Jebediah Fry. He snapped. The postmaster. He gave me his signed, notarized affidavit yesterday, detailing everything. The mail tampering, the forged ledger. He's terrified, but he did it. Ellis stuffed the papers into his satchel. I was going to file this in the county seat, but this changes the timeline. I'm riding to Cheyenne. Today. Judge Harlan is holding the circuit court. I'm not just filing a suit. I'm filing criminal charges for fraud, conspiracy, and, as of this morning, arson and attempted murder. I'm going to petition Judge Harlan for an immediate traveling hearing, right here, in Kestrel Flats. He'll never agree, Maeve said. A circuit judge. Travel here for a local dispute. He will, Ellis said, his voice grim. When I tell him the Union Pacific Railroad is using arson to burn witnesses out of his territory. The next 4 days were the longest of Nora's life. Ellis was gone. There was no word. The valley, Painted Mesa, which had become her sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Every gust of wind sounded like riders. Every shadow in the dusk seemed to hold a threat. She spent the time preparing. She stood in front of the small, cracked mirror that hung by the door, her hands clutching her original, torn shoes. She practiced her testimony. My name is Nora Bellamy. I came here on the 3rd of October. Her voice shook. She stopped. She took a breath. My name is Nora Bellamy. She began again, her voice stronger. I came to Kestrel Flats as the intended bride of Silas Duval. She practiced for hours, turning the fear into precision, the shame into a weapon. Calder worked. He did not talk about the hearing. He did not talk about Silas. He began rebuilding the goat pen. She watched him from the porch, hammering new, clean-smelling pine boards into the scorched black posts he had salvaged from the fire. He was building it in the exact same spot. Is that wise? She asked, walking out to him. Building it here where he knows to find it. Calder drove a nail home in one perfect stroke. He looked at the new pale wood against the blackened, scarred upright. He burned the wood. Nora. He didn't burn the ground it stands on. He ran his hand over the scorched post. A scar means the thing lived. It means it healed. You don't hide it. He picked up another clean board. You build on it. It makes the whole structure stronger. On the 5th day, Maeve rode in. Her mule lathered. He did it, she announced. Her face split in a rare, fierce grin. The lawyer did it. Judge Harlan is coming. He's bringing a territorial marshal. The hearing is set for tomorrow. 10 o'clock, St. Alder's Church. The relief was so sudden. Nora felt her knees weaken, but Maeve's face was still tight. But Silas knows. He's not running. His Cheyenne lawyer arrived on last night's train, and the men from the Black Lark, they rode out this morning toward Cheyenne. Calder stopped his hammering. The road. They're not going to let Ellis get here with the evidence. Ellis is smart, Maeve said. He's not taking the main road. He's cutting south. He's supposed to be at the old coal smokestacks by noon. We're going to meet him. We're going to bring him home. It was not a request. The 3 of them rode hard, not as victims, but as an escort. They met Ellis at the rendezvous, a desolate landscape of slag heaps and abandoned mine carts. The young lawyer looked exhausted, but his eyes were bright. He was carrying a heavy, locked satchel. It's all in here, he said. The judge is 2 hours behind me, with the marshal. Let's move, Calder said. They had not gone half a mile when Calder reined in, holding up his hand. On the ridge to the north, outlined against the sky, were 3 riders. Silas's men, Calder said, his voice flat. They were waiting. The riders spurred their horses, angling to cut them off, to force them into the narrow, rocky arroyo. They want the satchel, Ellis said, his voice high. They're not getting it. Maeve snapped. She looked at the riders, then at the arroyo, then at the smoking stacks of the abandoned coal mine to the south. This way, Maeve yelled. She grabbed the reins of Ellis's horse, pulling him with her. Calder, flank us. She did not ride away from the men. She rode past them, cutting hard left, off the trail, galloping straight for the smoking, sulphurous plumes of the old mine fires, which had been burning underground for a decade. "Maeve, no!" Ellis shouted. "They're railroad men!" Maeve screamed over the wind. "They're afraid of a mine, and they damn well won't follow us through the smoke." They plunged into the yellow-gray cloud. The air was thick, choking, tasting of rotten eggs and acid. It burned their lungs and blinded them. The horses panicked, but Maeve and Calder spurred them on. Nora clinging to Flint, her world reduced to the gray, coughing shape of Maeve's mule in front of her. They burst out the other side, gasping, their eyes streaming. Behind them, the three riders reined in at the edge of the smoke, confused, unwilling to enter the choking, hellish cloud. Maeve did not slow down. "We ride the creek bed home." They were gone. The next morning, St. Alder's church was packed. It was not a Sunday service. It was a formal hearing, the air thick with tension and the smell of wet wool. Judge Harlan sat at the front, where the altar should be, his face like carved granite. A UN. Marshall stood by the door. Silas Duval was there, seated in the front pew, his new Cheyenne lawyer beside him. He looked composed, arrogant, his vest immaculate. Ellis Rowan, Calder, and Nora sat on the opposite side. Maeve and the other widows sat behind them, a silent, grim chorus. Ellis was methodical. He laid out the case, his voice ringing with the authority of the law. He called Pastor Alder, who presented the marriage registry. He called Maeve, who presented the identical letters. He called Jebediah Fry, who, pale and trembling but protected by the marshal, confessed to the mail fraud. With every witness, Silas's lawyer objected. Hearsay circumstantial, the testimony of a known debtor, the ramblings of lonely spinsters. Judge Harlan overruled him every time. Noted, "Counselor, please sit." Finally, Ellis said, "The prosecution calls Nora Bellamy." Nora stood. The church was absolutely silent. She walked to the small table that served as the witness stand. She was carrying her old, torn shoes. "Miss Bellamy," Ellis began, his voice gentle, "please tell the court about the arrangement you had with Mr. Duval." Silas was smiling at her, a confident, cruel smirk. Nora looked at him, and the last of her fear burned away, replaced by a cold, clear calm. She did not speak. Instead, she placed the two ruined, mud-caked, broken shoes on the table, next to the Bible. "This," she said, her voice clear and strong, "is what I arrived with. This is all I owned." Silas's smirk faltered. "Mr. Duval has accused me of being a woman of no means, a gold digger, a runaway debtor. He is correct about the first. I brought nothing to Kestrel Flats. Nothing, except the truth." He looked at these shoes, and he looked at my honesty, and he decided they were both worthless. She looked from Silas to the judge. "But they are enough. They were enough to walk here, and they are enough to stand here and walk through his lies." She then laid out the entire story. The letters, the platform, the forgery, the fire. When she was finished, the silence in the church was absolute. Silas's lawyer was pale. He saw the case was lost. Silas Duval saw it, too, and the thin veneer of his civilization cracked. "She's lying," he roared, jumping to his feet, his face purple. "She's a tramp, a gutter trash liar." His lawyer grabbed his arm. "Silas, sit down. You'll believe this. This whore," Silas shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at Nora. "She's been sleeping in his barn. Everyone knows it. She's a common—" "Mr. Duval." Judge Harlan's voice was a whip crack, but Silas was gone, lost to his rage. Calder Pike stood up. He did not speak. He did not move towards Silas. He just stood, his full height, and looked at him. The message was clear. Silas faltered, his words dying in his throat, the hatred in his eyes turning to a sudden, panicked realization of what he had just done. Judge Harlan looked at Silas, his face filled with a cold, profound disgust. "Thank you, Mr. Duval," the judge said, his voice dangerously quiet. You have just confirmed the testimony regarding your character more effectively than this lawyer ever could. I have heard the sworn testimony of 4 witnesses. I have seen the county map. I have seen the evidence of mail fraud, and I have seen the defendant's own actions in this sacred room." He banged his gavel. "I find sufficient and overwhelming cause to bind this matter over for a full criminal trial. On the charges of conspiracy, mail fraud, and based on the testimony regarding the fire at the Pike Ranch arson." He looked at the marshal. "The defendant is a clear flight risk and, given his violent outburst and the evidence of arson, a manifest danger to this community. He is to be remanded into the custody of the territorial marshal, to be held without bail until the circuit trial." "You can't," Silas whispered, his arrogance gone, his face gray. "I represent—" "The marshal will take the prisoner," the judge ordered. Silas collapsed back into the pew as the marshal put a heavy hand on his shoulder. Nora did not watch. She did not look at Silas. She did not smile. She felt no victory, only the deep, quiet exhaustion of a battle won. She turned her head, looking past the pulpit, past the rows of stunned faces, to the small, clear glass window of the church. Through it, she could see the high, empty fields of the mesa, golden in the autumn light. The herd was grazing, safe. The real work was waiting. The silence that followed the verdict was heavier than the storm that had preceded it. Silas Duval was gone, a prisoner of the territory, his name already becoming a cautionary whisper in the saloons. But at Painted Mesa, the scar remained. The blackened, skeletal remains of the goat pen stood in the cold morning light, a monument to the fight. Calder was there at dawn, pulling the burned timbers apart, his hammer and pry bar ringing sharp and clear in the still air. Nora joined him, her hands, protected by thick leather gloves, hauling the charred wood to a pile for burning. They worked in their usual, economical silence, the shared rhythm of labor their truest language. They were not alone for long. Around 9 in the morning, a wagon appeared on the ridge. Nora's hand instinctively went to the pitchfork, the memory of arson still raw. But Calder did not tense. He just watched. It was not a threat. It was the blacksmith, Henderson, the one who had watched Nora's arrival from the platform. He pulled his wagon to a halt, not saying a word. He just climbed down, unloaded a crate of new milled pine boards, a heavy box of nails, and 2 hammers. He grunted at Calder. Daylight's burning. He picked up a hammer and walked to the ruin. An hour later, another wagon, Pastor Alder. He brought his 2 grown sons. They carried saws and levels. By noon, there were 4 wagons. The mercantile owner, who had once stared at her with suspicion, arrived with a keg of fresh water and a sack of coffee beans. Maeve Kestrel came, not with news, but with a huge pot of beef stew and a basket of fresh bread, setting up a makeshift table. The town had come. No one spoke of the trial. No one said, "We are sorry for the humiliation at the train station." They did not need to. They spoke in the language of the High Plains action. The pastor's wife, a stern woman who had been among the sharpest whisperers, walked directly to Nora. She was carrying 2 tin mugs of scalding coffee. She held one out. "Miss Bellamy," she said, her voice firm. "You look chilled." Nora's breath caught. It was the first time the woman had ever spoken to her. It was not an apology. It was an acceptance. "Thank you, Mrs. Alder," Nora said. Taking the cup, the men worked. A flurry of organized, practiced labor. They were ranchers and merchants, men who knew how to build, how to raise a structure from nothing. They measured twice, sawed once. They did not talk of Silas. They argued over the proper way to set a roof beam. Every hammer blow was an act of contrition. Every nail driven home was a retraction of the laughter that had met her on the platform. They were, in the only way they knew how, washing the town's shame from their hands. And they were doing it by rebuilding what her enemy had destroyed. Calder worked beside them, his presence steady. He was no longer the outsider. He was the man they were helping. He accepted their labor, a quiet, knowing nod for every board offered. by the time the sun began to dip, staining the mesa red. The new goat pen stood finished. It was larger than the old one, the wood pale and bright against the scarred, blackened posts they had refused to tear down. It was stronger. It was a testament. The men packed their tools, accepted the last of the stew, and nodded to Calder and Nora. "It'll hold." Henderson the blacksmith grunted. It was the highest praise he could give. They rode away in the twilight, leaving the scent of sawdust and community behind. Nora and Calder stood on the porch, watching them go. "A scar makes it stronger," Nora said quietly, repeating his words. He just nodded, placing his hand on the porch rail, his knuckles brushing hers. That night, the house felt different. It was truly theirs. The threat was gone. The cold, empty space of fear had been filled by the warmth of the day's labor, by the light of the fire. Nora took up her needle and sinew. She was finishing the project she had started weeks ago, her first pair of handmade shoes. She had used the templates Calder had, the ones his mother had used, but her hands were still new to the work. She pulled the last stitch, knotted the sinew, and held them up. They were, by any practical measure, a disaster. The leather was good, but the stitching was hopelessly uneven. The right sole curved slightly, as if it were perpetually turning a corner. The left shoe's tongue was sewn in at a visible slant. They were clumsy, stubborn, and utterly misshapen. And she loved them. She slipped her feet into them. They fit, awkwardly, but they fit. Calder came in from checking the stock, stamping the cold from his boots. He saw her turning her feet, inspecting her new, lopsided footwear. He stopped. He looked at the shoes, then at her hands, which were now cross-hatched with new calluses and needle pricks. He looked at her face, lit by the fire. His mouth, usually a firm, straight line, softened at the corners. He did not laugh. He did not praise. He just gave a single, short nod. It was, for him, a standing ovation. Nora beamed, a smile so wide it made her cheeks ache. The next day, Calder was the one at the workbench, carving. He took down the old, faded sign from the porch, painted mesa where the wind stops. He brought in a new, long plank of polished juniper. He had already carved the words they had agreed upon. Juniper ember. But he had added a new line beneath it. He showed it to her. Juniper ember. It read, "A place for the brave to rest. It's not just our story," he explained, his voice low. "It's a welcome for others." They hung it together, the new wood bright against the old logs of the house. Nora, too, felt the need to build. She found a long, smooth cottonwood log that had been washed down by the creek, silvered by the sun. She and Calder sawed it, and she spent 2 days sanding it smooth, setting it on stone legs beneath the largest juniper tree on the property, the one that overlooked the vast, empty sweep of the valley. It was a simple, backless bench. Calder watched her finish it. For watching the sunset. "No," Nora said, running her hand over the smooth wood. "It's the bench for those who waited in vain. It's a place to sit when you've given up waiting for a train. A place to rest before you start walking on your own." He understood. It was a grave marker for the girl she used to be. Their world began to ripple outward. Maeve Kestrel rode over, not with news of a threat, but with a proposition. "The trial's over," Maeve said, sipping coffee at the table. "But Martha Gable is still poor. The Henderson sisters are still in debt from what Silas did. We stopped the snake, but the venom's still in the system." "What are you proposing?" Nora asked. "A fund, but not charity, a skill share. I can teach any woman in this territory how to make soap good enough to sell in Cheyenne. You." She pointed at Nora. "You're smart. You can read and write. Half those women can't, and your leather work is earnest," she said, glancing at Nora's crooked shoes with a wry smile. "Calder is teaching me," Nora said, lifting her chin. "Then we teach them," Maeve said. "We teach them to read a contract so a man like Silas can't cheat them. We teach them a trade, saddle stitching, soap making, bookkeeping so they're not dependent on a man's promise. We make them their own providers. A new fire lit in Nora's eyes. This was the second half of the reckoning. Kestrel Flats changed. Ellis Rowan's shingle was now a permanent fixture, the only clean paint on the street. Nora had painted it herself. The letters were a little uneven, but the words were clear. Ellis Rowan, attorney, legal help for the voiceless. When Nora rode in for supplies, mounted confidently on Flint, the mercantile owner no longer saw a girl. He saw a customer. "Morning, Miss Bellamy." He'd call out, "Got a new bolt of that blue calico, just like you asked for." She was no longer the ragged bride. She was not Pike's woman. She had a title, one of geography and respect. She was Miss Bellamy of the Mesa. She belonged. Life at the ranch settled into a new rhythm, one defined not by survival, but by living. One bright, cold afternoon, 2 children from a neighboring ranch, the McCafferty boys, rode over. They were shy, awed by Calder. Calder, to Nora's surprise, was not grim. He was in the corral, a length of rope in his hands. He was patiently, quietly, showing the 8-year-old boy how to tie a running bowline. His large, scarred hands moved slowly, guiding the boy's smaller ones. Nora watched from the house, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the stove. She had been baking, using the last of the precious apples. Wrapped in oat dough, she walked out, carrying a plate. "You'll tie better knots if your stomach isn't growling," she said. The boys, who had been terrified of her, stared at the steaming, fragrant cakes. They snatched them, their shyness vanishing. Soon, the valley was filled with a sound Nora had never heard there before. The high, clear laughter of children. Calder looked up from his rope work, his eyes meeting Nora's across the corral. He saw her, her face flushed from the oven, smiling at the children. He gave her that same, small, private nod. This was life. This was the harvest. That night, Nora lay on her cot. The blankets pulled high. The wind, as it always did, began its high, lonesome howl around the corners of the house. It was the same sound that had terrified her on her first night. She heard the scream of the train whistle. She saw the leering, judging faces on the platform. She saw Silas, his hand out, the lilies dropping to the wood. She tensed, but then another sound, clearer. The sound of a hammer on new wood. The smell of sawdust and coffee. The feeling of Calder's hand, warm and solid, holding hers in the dark of the barn. The image of the platform flickered and faded. It was a ghost. It had no more power. For the first time since she had left Illinois, Nora Bellamy slept a full, deep, dreamless night. She woke to the light, not to a sound, or to the cold, but to the brilliant, flooding light of the high plains dawn. She rose, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, and stepped onto the porch. The world was ablaze. The mesas were painted in streaks of impossible red and deep, glowing gold. The air was so clear it hurt to breathe, and it smelled of juniper and snow. She looked at the new strong goat pen. She looked at the new sign, Juniper Ember, glinting in the morning light. She heard Calder moving inside, the scrape of the coffee grinder, a solid, predictable, comforting sound. The future. It was no longer a desperate word on a yellowed piece of paper. It was not a vague, formless hope. It was the solid, cold porch boards under her feet. It was the rough wool of the blanket on her skin. It was the man in the next room. It had shape. It had weight. It was real. It was not a day set aside for God. It was a Tuesday. But the sky had turned a deep, impossible blue, and the first true warmth of spring had finally broken the long, iron winter. It was a day that felt holy in its own right, a day of sudden, unexpected grace. They held the wedding in the high meadow behind the barn, on the soft grass that smelled of sage and thawing earth. There was no church, save for the cathedral of the Red Rock Mesas. There were no pews, only long benches that Calder and Maeve had sawed from a fallen cedar, the wood still pale and smelling of resin. An arch had been fashioned by the McCafferty boys, a clumsy, joyful thing woven from budding willow branches and the first stubborn purple wildflowers. The guests were few. Maeve Kestrel, her face scrubbed clean, her hair uncharacteristically pinned. Ellis Rowan, his suit still too large, but his eyes bright. Pastor Alder and his wife. Henderson the blacksmith, and the McCafferty family. It was not a town gathering. It was a gathering of witnesses, of the people who had rebuilt the goat pen. A small, tinny sound cut the air. The youngest McCafferty boy, his face red with concentration, began to play a tune on his harmonica. He was not a good musician. The notes were reedy, often flat, and he stumbled twice on the simple melody. But it was the most beautiful music Nora had ever heard. Calder stood under the arch. He was not a man transformed by finery. He was a man pared down to his essentials. He wore a clean white shirt, the sleeves rolled to his forearms, his work-worn hands scrubbed raw. His dark hair, usually wild, was damp and combed back, smelling sharply of the pine soap he'd used. He was not smiling. He was watching the path from the house, his entire being focused, his gray eyes steady and impossibly soft. Nora came. She did not wear a veil. She wore her gray wool dress, the one she had saved in her valise, now mended and pressed. Her feet, scarred but healed, were bare on the cool, soft grass. She was walking on the land that was now hers, and she would not have leather between her and it, in her hands. She did not carry flowers. She carried, like a testament, the clumsy, misshapen pair of leather shoes she had made with her own hands, a symbol not of where she had been, but of what she had become. She stopped in front of him, the harmonica wheezing to a halt. They just looked at each other, for a long, silent moment. The world, the guests, the wind itself, seemed to recede. Maeve Kestrel stepped forward, her gaze fierce. She was holding a long, bright blue scarf, the color of the sky. She did not ask permission. She took Calder's left hand and Nora's right hand and, with a series of quick, rough movements, bound their wrists together. "This is a knot of the high plains," Maeve said, her voice rough, pulling the silk tight. "It is not metal, it is not gold, it is stronger. It is a knot that pulls tighter when the storm comes. Do not untie it." Ellis Rowan stepped forward next, holding a small book. He looked nervous, his eyes darting from Nora to Calder. "I am an attorney," he began, his voice thin. "I do not know the words of God. I only know the words of men, and the words of men can be broken, as we have seen. They can be twisted, they can be forged." He looked at their bound hands. "Honor," he said, his voice gaining a sudden, clear strength, "is not a ring. It is not a promise written on paper. Honor is how you hold hands in front of the world. It is a thing you build, every day, like a good, strong fence. This is good." He nodded. His part finished, Pastor Alder, his face softened by a smile, simply said, "Then say the words you have." Nora looked at Calder. Her voice did not tremble. "You never," she said, her voice clear. "You never once looked at me as a burden. You did not see a broken thing. You saw a person, and you gave me ground to stand on." Calder's throat worked. He had never been a man of easy words. He looked at her bare feet on the grass, at the clumsy, beloved shoes in her hands. He looked at her eyes, which had seen hell and had not looked away. "You came here," he said, his voice rough with an emotion that shook him, "with nothing, and you brought me the one thing a man cannot buy and cannot build." He swallowed, forcing the word out. "You brought courage." "Then," Pastor Alder said, his voice gentle, "by the authority of God and the territory of Wyoming, I pronounce you man and wife." Cal here leaned in. The kiss was not the desperate, finding kiss of the storm-swept barn. It was simple. It was public. It was a seal. His lips were warm, sure, and tasted of the high, clear air. It was a kiss that said mine. It was a kiss that said home. The harmonica player, taking this as his cue, burst into a loud, fast, and completely tuneless reel. Someone clapped. Then Henderson the blacksmith let out a whoop, and the ceremony was over, and the celebration began. It was not a ball, it was a party in a meadow. Maeve and Mrs. Alder unveiled a table laden with food, the beef stew, fresh bread, and 3 apple pies. Calder produced a jug of hard cider. The harmonica player was relentless. He stomped his foot, his tune a chaotic, joyful noise. Calder, his hand still bound in Nora's, turned to her with a look of pure, unadulterated mischief she had never seen. "I believe," he said, "we are required to dance." "I don't know how," she laughed. "Neither do I," he said. He pulled her into the center of the meadow. They spun, clumsy, awkward, bound together by the blue scarf. They stumbled on the uneven ground. They laughed. Nora, who had not laughed in her whole adult life, threw her head back and laughed, a full, joyous sound that echoed off the mesas. Calder spun her, his boots stomping, his face lit with a rare, unguarded joy. They were absurd, and they were beautiful. Maeve grabbed Ellis Rowan, forcing the shy lawyer to dance. The McCafferty boys chased the ranch hens, which, offended by the music, were clucking and scattering, becoming unwitting guests. The wind picked up, cool and sweet, carrying the smell of the pine trees, the feast, and the wild grass. They danced until the sun began to sink, until they were breathless, until Nora's cheeks ached from smiling, until the last of the laughter had become a quiet, shared peace. Later, as the guests began to pack their wagons, Nora and Calder stood on the porch of the house. The light was golden, the air turning cool. Propped against the door, where she had left them, were her original torn shoes, the ones she had arrived in, the ones that had been her badge of shame. Calder picked one up. He looked at the split leather, the sole worn through. He held it, this ruin, as if it were precious. He reached up and hung it from a wooden peg beside the new sign, the one that read Juniper Ember. Nora hung the other one beside it. They were not a memory of shame. They were a coat of arms, a trophy, a permanent, defiant testament to the journey, hung at the very door of the destination. The last wagon, Maeve's, was just disappearing over the ridge. Calder had his arm around Nora's waist, her head resting on his shoulder. They were watching the sky turn from gold to apricot. A sound made them turn. It was the sound of a footstep, hesitant, on the path. A footstep, and then a stop. A young woman was standing at the new fence line, near the bench Nora had built. She was perhaps 16, her coat thin, her face pale with exhaustion and streaked with dust. Her shoes were worn, the leather cracked in her hand. She clutched a single, yellowed envelope. She stood there, one hand on the fence, as if she did not have the strength to open the gate, and was terrified to try. She looked at the house, at the sign, at the couple on the porch. With the raw, desperate hope of a drowning person sighting land, Nora froze. She was looking at a mirror. She was looking at herself. Just 6 months ago. The same fear, the same desperation, the same letter, promising a life that was probably a lie. Calder felt her tense, and he knew. The girl saw them looking and flinched, taking a step back, as if she expected to be yelled at, to be told to move on. Nora untangled herself from Calder's arm. She did not stay on the porch. She walked down the steps, across the small patch of earth, onto the grass. She walked until she was standing right in front of the gate. She did not ask the girl her name. She did not ask what she wanted. She just looked at the girl's exhausted face, at her desperate eyes, at the worn-out shoes. Nora smiled. It was the smile of the sanctuary, the smile of the harbor. She reached out and unlatched the gate, swinging it wide open. "You've come a long way," Nora said, her voice soft but strong as iron. "That's enough. Come inside." She put her arm around the girl's thin, trembling shoulders and guided her toward the house. Calder watched them, his wife and the new arrival. The sun finally touched the top of the western mesa, and the long shadows of the 3 figures on the path stretched eastward, merging, becoming one single, solid shadow that looked like the road they had all Finally, finished walking. The seasons turned. The high, brutal winter of Wyoming descended, locked Painted Mesa in snow, and then, slowly, reluctantly, gave way to a wet, muddy spring. By the time the high meadows were dry and the grass was turning green, the world had changed. The circuit judge in Cheyenne had been thorough, faced with the combined testimony of a pastor, the notarized confession of a postmaster, and the cold, hard evidence of the county plat map. Silas Duvall's new lawyer had no defense. The trial lasted one day. Silas was convicted on all counts: conspiracy to defraud, mail fraud, and arson. The railroad, seeing the tide of public opinion, had cut him loose the day the verdict came down. His name, which had once been a symbol of power and progress in Kestrel Flats, was reduced to a lesson. It became a story told by old-timers in the Black Lark Saloon, a cautionary tale about a man who got too greedy, who mistook a woman's desperation for weakness, and who forgot that you cannot burn a man like Calder Pike off his own land. The name Silas Duvall was no longer a threat. It was just a ghost, and a pathetic one at that. The change in Kestrel Flats was not loud, but it was deep. The Maeve Nora Fund, as the town began to call it, was not a charity. It was an investment. Before the snow melted, Martha Gable had used her portion to buy 2 new milk cows and a butter churn. By spring, she was the sole supplier of butter to the hotel. The Henderson sisters, freed from their fraudulent debt, reopened their small bakery, and the third woman, the young widow from the far side of the territory, used her funds to buy passage back east, to a family that would have her. The fund had not just saved them, it had made them independent. At the post office, Jebediah Fry was gone, having left town on the same train that carried Silas away. He was replaced by a stern, humorless man from Cheyenne, who did not drink and who took his federal position with the utmost seriousness. He hung a large, hand-painted sign above the counter. Right next to the postal rates, "All mail is sealed and sacred. The law will be enforced." The town, which had once viewed the mail as idle gossip, now treated it with a quiet respect. At Painted Mesa, life expanded. Nora, who had once been the student, became the teacher. On Tuesday and Thursday nights, she rode Flint into town, to St. Alder's Church. It was no longer just for Sunday sermons. It was now the Kestrel Flats Night School. Her students were a strange, hopeful collection. The McCafferty boys, learning their letters. 3 ranchers who wanted to be able to read their own contracts. And Sarah, the young, quiet girl they had taken in on their wedding day, her eyes wide as she learned to form the words she had never been taught. Nora stood at the front, a piece of chalk in her hand, the hand that had once trembled so badly she could not hold a coffee cup, the hand that had been rubbed raw by the pulley rope, the hand that had been pierced by the awl as she stitched her first shoe. That hand was now steady. It was sure. She wrote the letters large and clear on the slate, her voice ringing with a quiet, patient authority. And Calder built. With the threat to his land gone, he finally did what his mother had always dreamed of. He and Henderson the blacksmith used 3 sticks of dynamite to blast the narrowest part of the Nighthawk Creek Canyon. It was a clean break. Calder spent a month with a team of mules, dragging rock, digging a new, shallow channel. One morning, he opened the diversion gate. Water, for the first time, flowed into the dry west pasture. By midsummer, what had been a field of brown, cured grass was now knee-high and rich. Green alfalfa. The herd, which had been lean, grew fat. The mares, once thin, now dropped healthy, strong-legged foals. Painted Mesa was no longer a place of survival. It was a place of abundance. Calder Pike, who had inherited a ranch built on stubbornness, was now the master of one built on prosperity. One night, late in that first summer, the air was still and warm. The sky was so clear, the stars looked like chips of ice, sharp and bright. Nora and Calder were sitting on the bench she had built, the bench for those who waited in vain. It was no longer that. It was just their bench. They sat, not touching, but close, their shoulders a few inches apart, sharing the same quiet space. The windmill turned, a slow, Rhythmic squeak groan, no longer a sound of alarm, but the sound of water, the pulse of the ranch. They sat for a long time, watching a stray meteor draw a line of fire across the sky. Nora leaned her head, finally, on his shoulder. It was a familiar, comfortable weight. "Calder," she whispered. He made a low, quiet sound. "That night," she said, "in the barn, when you said about tomorrow being a war. I remember." "It wasn't," she said, her voice soft. "Not really. The fight was already over. We just had to show them." He did not answer, but his hand found hers in the darkness, lacing his fingers through hers. Callus against callus. She was quiet for another minute, staring at the vast, starry darkness. "I think about that first day," she whispered. "At the station, if I had arrived with anything, a proper dress, money in my purse, if I hadn't just had those torn shoes." He turned his head, his rough cheek brushing the top of her hair. He was silent, but his grip on her hand tightened, just slightly. "If that was all I brought," she breathed, the question she had held for a year. "Was it really?" "Nora," he interrupted, his voice a low, sure rumble in the dark, the same voice that had cut through the wind on the platform. He did not let her finish the question. "Then you brought everything." The words settled between them. Not a comfort, not a compliment. A fact, the final, bedrock truth of their lives. He turned his face, and she lifted hers. They kissed. It was not the desperate, finding kiss of the storm-swept barn. It was not the public, joyful kiss of their wedding. This was the slow, sure, quiet kiss of a summer night. The kiss of knowing. It was a kiss that had no questions left in it. Through the open window of the house, the fire in the hearth burned low, casting deep, red-gold embers. The light flickered on the sign that hung by the door. Juniper Ember. A place for the brave to rest. The next week, Nora and Sarah rode to town. Sarah, who had arrived as a terrified, silent girl, was now talkative, her laughter easy. She was helping Nora hang a new sign outside a small, rented shop next to Ellis Rowan's office. Nora had painted it herself. The stitches on the painted saddle were still a little crooked, but the letters were bold, clear, and proud. Bellamy Pike, Leather Goods Repair. Her name. First, Calder, who had ridden in with them, claiming he needed to see the blacksmith, watched her hang it. He did not say he was proud. He just nodded, that short, sharp nod that was, for him, a symphony of approval. That evening, when they returned to Painted Mesa, Nora went to the porch. The two ruined shoes still hung by the door, caked in old mud, the leather cracked and gray. They were symbols of her humiliation. They were her coat of arms. She took them down, holding them in her hands. She thought of the girl who had worn them, the girl who had fallen, the girl who had been so broken. She went inside. She took the small bottle of black ink from the desk and a sharp, clean pen. She sat by the fire, the old, torn boot in her lap, and on the thin, cracked, faded leather of the inner sole, the place that had touched her bruised foot. She wrote one word, arrived. She did the same to the other. Then, with a feeling of profound, quiet finality, she took them back to the porch. She hung them on their pegs, not as a memory of a journey, but as a map that was, at last, complete. She hung them right where the morning sun would touch them first, because here, in this wind-blasted land, revenge is not a bullet, it is not a fire. It is the simple, brutal, and cleansing act of dragging a lie into the sunlight. And love. Love is not a promise in a letter. It is the stubborn, brave, and quiet work of staying, of building, of showing up, day after day, even when all you brought with you was a pair of torn shoes. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are tuning in from. Let us know in the comments, and share your thoughts on Nora and Calder's journey. Please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and support us further by hitting that hype button, so this story can be heard by more folks just like you.